Hello, friends. Howdy doody. I'm just full disclosure. We have a full house tonight, and our dogs are kind of crazy because it's nice outside. So at any given time, there could be children screaming, dogs barking, husbands yelling. This is real life, friends. So at any point in time during our live tonight, you could hear any of those things. This is the Raider household. So I can already hear him upstairs getting a little crazy. So full disclosure. Just waiting for some of my friends to get on here. We what? We what? Oh, this is we, yeah. You got the song stuck in your head. It's beautiful outside. I can't believe it's 7:30. Here comes somebody. Told you.
He took the lamb hostage.
Okay, say hi to everybody on Instagram.
He took the lamb hostage.
Haley.
What?
Hello, Dawn. How are you?
I have a hostage situation.
Well, Haley, you've taken your hostage situation on my Instagram Live.
Oh, hi.
See.
FBI, open up.
Haley.
What?
Enough.
What?
My life. Jealous?
Fair enough.
Dawn, don't you miss having all your kids home? I'm sure it was quiet. Howdy doody. Who is I Am King? Who are ya? Let me see. I can't get close enough. I feel like I know. Dawn, everybody talks about empty nest, and I am going to miss these kids. I really will. But it will be really quiet. And the first night, it might not be terrible. Oh, hi, Malik. It might not be terrible the first night.
Open the door.
As long as they come back and visit me. But
Mindy, tell Jonathan to open the door.
Haley, I told you to be quiet, and that didn't seem to work either. So what makes you think he's going to open the door for me?
Open it again. Dude.
All right, we're going to get started in just a second. Because I just want to... Crazy. See, Malik, I told you that kids are crazy at my house, and you didn't believe me. Is that... Who's this that just joined? Will... Who would that be? All right. William, I thought that was you, but it didn't look like your picture. All right, guys, we're going to get started with chapter 10. And it's called Recess. Mrs. Marlowe was the 5th grade science teacher, and it was her day for outdoor recess duty. As she was gulping down a quick lunch in the teacher's room, Mr. Lipton, the custodian, stuck his head in the door and said, "Anybody want to see a miracle? Go check out the cafeteria. The 5th graders aren't talking today, not even whispering. It's like a funeral in there." But Mrs. Marlowe didn't have a moment to spare. She finished her lunch, grabbed her coat, and hurried outside to the playground through the gym. Even without the heads up from the custodian, it wouldn't have taken her long to figure out that something was different at outside recess today. Every teacher knows the sound of a normal, happy playground at lunchtime. Kids talking and yelling and chasing, and all the arguments about who's it or who's out and who ran faster. Not today. Mrs. Marlowe could tell that a whole layer of spoken sound was missing. Gone. Absent. Except... not completely, because the kids did make some slip-ups during their first wordless recess. Allie Bedford got caught whispering to Lena Henderson by the swing set, and when a group of boys stood and shook their fingers at her, she held up 8 fingers to show how many illegal words she had just said. Christina Farley didn't have to confess because half the kids on the playground heard exactly what she said loud and clear. She stomped her feet, stuck out her tongue at Rachel Morgan, and then shouted, "You're a terrible friend, and you lie, and you're selfish, and I don't care how many words this is, and you're mean too," which was 23 words. Christina's goof, plus the 8 words Allie whispered, meant that Dave got to record 31 points against the girls on his official score sheet, which wasn't as fancy as Lindsay's red notebook, just a couple of folded index cards stuffed in his pocket. But the boys weren't perfect either. Scott Vickers booted a kickball down the third base line, and when two boys made the foul ball motion, he yelled, "Foul? Are you crazy? No way! That ball was fair!" And Scott would have kept on yelling, but Bill Harkness tackled him and clamped a hand over his mouth, which Scott bit, but not hard enough to make Bill yell any words. That incident cost the boys 10 points. And then there was the first case of trickery. Katie Edison snuck up behind Jeremy Stevens, who was standing by the sliding board, tapped him on the shoulder, and when he turned his head, she gave him a big, noisy kiss on the cheek. Jeremy howled and wiped his face and flew into a fit of cootyitis. "Oh, yuck! Why did you do that? That was so gross! Yuck! Help me get this stuff off my face!" Which was 20 more points for the girls. Plus, Katie actually enjoyed her little sneak attack. She'd had a top secret crush on Jeremy for 2 months. Even though there were only a few word blasts, it certainly wasn't quiet out there, and it got noisier and noisier as the end of recess got closer. That's because everyone began to realize that this was not a contest to see who could be silent. It was just about not talking. Sounds were allowed, as long as they weren't words. Dave was near the door of the gym and began whistling. He was instantly joined by 4 other boys. They whistled every song they could think of. "Row, row, row your boat," "Now I Know My ABCs," "London Bridge is Falling Down," Barney's marching song, the Star Wars theme song, "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," "I've Been Working on the Railroad," "Rubber Ducky," on and on. The whistling was mostly off-key, but it was a grand performance anyway, with lots of clapping and hooting between tunes. Somewhere near the middle of the whistling concert, 6 or 7 girls began screaming. These were not the kind of screams that make grown-ups come running. They were just an ugly assortment of squeals and yelps and shrieks that everyone else found very annoying. Spaced out around the edge of the playground, the girls were bouncing their high-pitched sounds around like a beach ball at a baseball stadium. Ew! Ooh-wee! Ooh-ha! Yee! They make lots of noise, but they weren't talking. Some other girls... Thor thought that meant I needed him here. Some other girls were jumping double dutch, and since they couldn't chant the rhymes, the kids who weren't jumping or turning the ropes clapped out the rhythm of the words with their hands. The quietest activity involved 4 girls who had a printed folder that showed how to use American Sign Language. They sat in a circle on the ground and practiced their hand signals. Stop, Thor. And to round out the soundscape, Bradley Lang and Tyler Renner were cruising around the playground, bothering as many girls as possible by making all sorts of mouth sounds. Clicks, pops, roars, quacks, barks, burps, and especially those loud bathroom noises created by putting the palms of both hands over your mouth, puffing up the cheeks, and blooping out a blast of air. Mrs. Marlowe could see there was plenty of activity, but those high-pitched playground voices, all that buzz and chatter and calling out, all that was definitely missing. There was no mistaking it. These kids were not talking, which would have been unusual for any group of students. But for this group of students, the custodian had called it right. It was practically a miracle. But why? There had to be a reason they were all acting this way. And as a science-minded person, Mrs. Marlowe was curious. So as she stood there thinking, Mrs. Marlowe began to adjust her afternoon lesson plan. Because in about 10 minutes, 26 of these 5th graders would be sitting in a room ready for science class. And there was nothing Mrs. Marlowe liked better than a good experiment. Lucy. Chapter 11. Sorry. Told you, anything could happen. Questions and answers. In all her years of teaching, 17 in total, Mrs. Marlowe had never walked into a quieter classroom full of students. It was a new experience for her. It was also new for the kids. Dave watched Mrs. Marlowe go to the front of the room and pick up her attendance book. The teacher looked at the list of names in the book, looked up and down the rows of the class, looked at the book again and said, "I thought maybe I was in the wrong room. Pretty quiet in here today. Could someone tell me why?" No hands went up. But Mrs. Marlowe was watching for anything that might give her a clue about this unusual behavior. And after her question, she saw a few sly glances between kids, and she noticed some of them trying to hide a smile. She knew what those looks and smiles meant. These kids were keeping a secret. Time for her first experiment. Looking over the class, Mrs. Marlowe settled her eyes on Seth Townsend, smiled, and said, "So, Seth, did you do your science homework last night?" With no hesitation, Seth smiled back and said, "Yes, I did." Mrs. Marlowe looked at Amy Gibson and said, "How about you, Amy?" She nodded and said, "It was hard." "Really? What did you think was hard about it? She asked. Amy scrunched up her face and then said, too much math. Her answer got a lot of nods and a few laughs from the other kids, but then it was completely quiet again. Mrs. Marlowe couldn't get over how beautifully these children were behaving. Just yesterday, she had asked one student a question, and about 15 others had blurted out answers, and then the whole class began arguing, and that had started a huge free-for-all that didn't end until she banged on her desk with the book. It was always like that with this class and with the other fifth grade classes, too. Oh my gosh, does that not sound like our class? But not today. No one talked at all, unless she asked a question, which gave Mrs. Marlowe an idea. Please get out your homework sheets. There was a lot of rustling and bustling as the students obeyed. Now, she said, Ellen, look at problem number 1. How did you decide if the given quantities were reasonable? Ellen rifled through her papers, and the look on her face surprised Mrs. Marlowe. Ellen looked scared. It was one of the standard questions about science problems, and question the whole class was used to. But the girls seemed completely confused. Mrs. Marlowe could see that she'd done the assignment. Plus, Ellen was one of the best science students. What was she so scared about? After a few moments of what looked like absolute panic, Ellen calmed down. Then very slowly she said, the numbers worked. Mrs. Marlowe waited for the rest of her explanation. It didn't come. Right, she said, and I made estimates. Again, her words came slowly, and then there was another long pause. And, the teacher urged, I used math. Mrs. Marlowe nodded. Of course you use math, but I want to hear about your process, your thinking. Ellen said, I did comparing. Frustrated, Mrs. Marlowe turned to the other side of the room. Dave, tell us the answer you got for problem 1 and explain your process. Dave didn't look scared, but he also took a long time to respond. Too long for Mrs. Marlowe. She said, I like your answer today, Mr. Packer. Slowly, Dave said, 440. 440 what? Prompted Mrs. Marlowe. Barrels of oil, Dave said slowly. Said Mrs. Marlowe. Dave said, per day. Wrong, said Mrs. Marlowe. Look at your work and tell me what you forgot. She was losing her patience. Dave frowned and squinted at his paper. He nodded and slowly said, the first day. The ripple of giggles swept through the room. Girl giggles. This is a picture of her trying to answer, being scared. Mrs. Marlowe snapped. Since when did wrong answers become funny? The science teacher thought, are they all pretending to be stupid today? Is that it? Whatever was going on, she didn't like it. It was disruptive. It was slowing down her class. It was annoying. And suddenly, Mrs. Marlowe was in no mood for games. She was not going to play along. If these kids wanted quiet, then that's what they were going to get. She glared around the room. Pass in your papers. Everyone obeyed without a word. Open to chapter 4 and read. The homework is on the board. The next 34 minutes in the science room passed in complete silence, except for the rustle of paper and an occasional cough or sniffle. And sitting at her desk, Mrs. Marlowe had to admit that she enjoyed the quiet, enjoyed not having to fight the battle of the mouth every second with these kids. The unshushables were completely shushed all right. Very weird. But the science teacher wasn't any closer to figuring out why the kids were acting this way. Dave felt something hit his arm and then drop onto his leg. It was a note. He glanced at Mrs. Marlowe. All clear. So he slowly reached down, picked up the note, and unfolded it. You said the first day. Counts as a word. So you said 4, and you cost the boys 1 whole point. Loser. Ha ha, Lindsay. Dave knew Lindsay was sitting 2 seats back on his left, and he knew she was waiting for him to turn around so she could give him a sickly sweet little smile. He didn't turn around, but he felt the tops of his ears getting pink, and he began thinking of a million things he wished he could say to her. All sorts of clever insults like, if brains were money, you'd be broke, or, wow, you can count to 4, or, I had a pet turtle that, Mr. Packer, bring it here. Dave snapped to attention and looked up to see Mrs. Marlowe staring at him, holding out her hand. Putting on his best innocent face, Dave said, what? The note, here. As Dave walked up and dropped the note into Mrs. Marlowe's hand, the bell rang. Mrs. Marlowe tucked the paper into her pocket and then stood up quickly, because when the bell rang, she had to hurry out her door and try to maintain law and order in the hallway between classes. But, of course, there was no need for the corridor police, not today. Mrs. Marlowe watched all the 5th graders move from room to room, smiling, waving, making faces, nodding at each other. There were a few laughs and whistles, and she heard Tyler Renner make a loud snort in the general direction of some girls, but there was no talking. She looked across the hall and caught Mrs. Escobar's eye, and they both smiled and then shrugged at each other. And since there wasn't any patrol work to do, Mrs. Marlowe reached into her pocket and pulled out the captured note, and she read it. For a logical person like Mrs. Marlowe, Lindsay's note to Dave was like the Rosetta Stone, a key that helped her begin to understand what she had seen and heard on the playground and then in her classroom. So this whole thing was something about counting words. More than 3 words resulted in a penalty, which explained all those short answers from Ellen and Dave. And it was the boys against the girls. Nothing new about that. Not with this group, and they were all trying to keep quiet. Mrs. Marlowe remembered the Jinx game from her own school years, when 2 people said the same word at the same time and then had to keep quiet. Maybe it was like that. Except this wasn't 2 people. It was more than 125 of the most talkative children on planet Earth. As chunks of the puzzle began to fall into place, Mrs. Marlowe immediately thought, the others are going to love this. She meant the other teachers, but then her scientific curiosity kicked in, and she thought, why spoil the kids' experiment? And I should really let the other teachers figure things out on their own. And of course, my preliminary findings could be wrong. I should certainly gather more data before I present my theory to the scholarly community. And as Mrs. Marlowe chuckled at her private joke, she said to herself, kids. Chapter 12, Guessing Games. Tuesday afternoon, the 5th grade hall was a challenge for everyone. Mrs. Akers walked into the music room, sat at her piano, smiled, and said, my, you all are behaving so well this afternoon. Wonderful. Now please open your song books to This Land Is Your Land. As she played the introduction on the piano, she said, back straight, big smiles, deep breaths, and no one sang. The piano stopped mid-measure, and Mrs. Akers frowned at the class. Now I know you all can do better than that. She began the introduction again, counting in the beats. 1 and 2 and 3. This land is your land. Miss Akers stopped. She was singing a solo, and her high, quivering voice made the kids giggle. She frowned again. All right, students, this is not funny, and it's not good. We have less than 2 weeks before our Thanksgiving program, and we have no time for this kind of silliness. She pointed a bright pink fingernail around the room. Brian, Tommy, Anna, every one of you. I want to hear you sing. She banged out the introductions again, and the whole class sang. This land is... and then stopped. The piano kept playing, and Mrs. Akers bellowed, sing! And most of the kids jumped in on, my land from... and then stopped. And after shouted command, they sang, the redwood forest... and that's how the whole song went, chopped up into 3-word bits. And when Mrs. Akers, her face bright red by this point, thumped on her piano and said, what is wrong with all of you today? The kids didn't say a word. Like all teachers, Mrs. Akers understood the divide and conquer rule. When you need to get to the bottom of something, you don't ask the whole class, you ask one student. Truth. So she pointed at Lena in the front row and said, why aren't you singing? Lena hesitated and then motioned at the kids all around the room and said, not talking today. Miss Akers said, what's that supposed to mean? Not talking? Lena nodded. Only 3 words. The music teacher was even more puzzled. She pointed at James and said, explain. James had trouble expressing himself even under the best conditions. He gulped and took a deep breath. Then he said, not words, everyone. A light dawned on Miss Akers' face, and still talking to James, she said, oh, so is it like that? Hi, Haley. So is it like that project kids do when they take a vow of silence to protest how there's still slavery in Africa? I read about that. Is that it? James looked lost. He shook his head. Hard, explain, not. But Mrs. Akers felt like she had answered the riddle, or maybe partly answered it. And whatever was happening, she decided to be a good sport. Looking around the room, she said, so tell me, can you all hum? Is humming allowed? Everyone grinned and nodded like maniacs. How about clapping? Can you clap in rhythm? More smiles and nods. All right, then here we go again. And she ripped back into the piano. 1 and 2 and 3. And 24 5th graders clapped and hummed along as Mrs. Akers played all 7 verses of This Land Is Your Land. Then the whole class giggled and laughed and hummed and clapped their way through the other 4 songs on the Thanksgiving program. And they all survived their first wordless music class. The 5th grade period gym class was less dramatic than music. News had gotten to most of the teachers that the fifth graders had gone quiet, which didn't bother the gym teacher at all. Tuesday was dodgeball day, so Mrs. Henley appointed the two captains, and then the captains picked their teams by pointing, and the first game got underway, all without a word. Dodgeball, which can be pretty serious anyway, seemed especially grim without the talking and shouting. There were the usual grunts of effort and screams of terror, and when 3 or 4 kids with red dodgeballs would silently go hunting for one player on the other team, it was sort of like watching a pack of wolves go after a lone caribou. A motion of the leader's head, a movement toward the prey, and then whack, whack, whoomp, dead meat. From the gym teacher's point of view, dodgeball was all about improving reflexes and getting a good large motor skills workout, and to accomplish those goals without any of the taunting and teasing and name calling. That was just fine by her. Even so, Mrs. Henley watched all 3 games with great interest, and she saw how the kids communicated without words. And she noticed herself pointing and shaking her head and blowing her whistle instead of yelling. It was nice to give her voice a rest. Mr. Burton taught 5th grade reading and language arts. He was puzzled at the beginning of the class right after lunch, and like the music teacher and the science teacher, he asked questions and got 3-word answers. But he kept at it, and after about 5 minutes, he figured out what was going on, at least part of it. Unlike Mrs. Marlowe, Mr. Burton had a lot of patience and a pretty good sense of humor, and he couldn't see any real problem with having these kids be this well behaved. Anything that got the unshushables quiet was fine by him. Plus, he decided they could all have some fun with this limit of 3 words in a row. He picked a funny story from their reading textbook, a really short one, and he had the kids read it out loud, 3 words each and as fast as possible, with him calling out the name of the next narrator. And when the story was finished, he said, "Okay, now I want you to make up a story." He picked up a meter stick and said, "When I point at you, say a 3-word sentence and listen carefully so you can make the story move forward. Here we go." The story started like this. A woman screamed. She was scared. It was dark. "Oh no, snakes!" One bit her. "Ow, my leg!" She limped outside. Her neighbor came. "What's wrong?" "Snakes everywhere." "Are they poisonous?" "Yes, and smelly." "Quick, my car." "You saved me." "Darn dead battery." Round and round the room the story went. The poor woman and her neighbor were eventually eaten by the huge orange lizards that came up out of the sewers and ripped the roof off the car. The lizards also ate all the snakes. But then some ugly tulips in the garden grew razor blade teeth and ate lizards, and then the tulips burped giant burps, which created a tornado that made the Statue of Liberty fall over and crush a tugboat, which made a wave that washed all the way to the White House and got muddy water all over the president's polka-dotted underpants. It was quite a tale. The period ended, and as the students walked quietly out of the room, Mr. Burton got a lot of waves and smiles and thumbs up, and he waved and smiled back at the kids. No words were needed. It had been a successful class, fun, creative, lively, and everyone had used their word skills in new ways. Mr. Burton felt great. The next 40 minutes was his planning period, and then he came to the last class of the day, period 7. He had some papers to grade, but Mr. Burton was too excited because what these kids were doing, well, it felt like a once-in-a-lifetime chance to mess around with words and language and in communication, to try something fresh, something special. After all, science teachers aren't the only people who like a good experiment. So Mr. Burton sat at his desk thinking and thinking. There's this Mr. Burton there thinking and thinking. So Mr. Burton sat at his desk thinking and thinking. Finally, with about 2 minutes before period 7, he got it. A great idea. Plus, he realized that this situation could be useful to him in a totally unexpected way. And as the bell rang, Mr. Burton noticed that he was actually looking forward to his last class of the afternoon. Another proof that this was not an ordinary day. That was our next 3 chapters of our book, No Talking. Hello, Kimberly. Oh, Cheyenne. Do you have some of my friends with you? Tell them hi, and I love them, miss them. We're about halfway through our book. What do you think? I love it. I think it's super fun, especially the 3 words. I wonder if we could do that in our class. I'm not confident that we could. Haley wants to make an appearance. At least smile and don't look all glim.
What do you want me to do?
If you insist on getting in it, then you at least need to say hello. All right, friends, we're off for dinner, and it sounds like our dogs are going to start getting crazier again. And the fact that my family's been this quiet for this long is amazing. So Have a good night. Enjoy what's left of the sunshine and the warm, windy weather. And I will see you all tomorrow.
We start yelling now?
No.